So, how do we really test big ideas about human behavior? Things like fairness or rationality? You can't just ask people what they would do, you've got to see it happen. And that's where economic experiments come in. Economists create these tiny, controlled little worlds to see how we react when the pressure's on. And believe me, some of the results are not at all what you'd expect.
Okay, let's try one right now. Imagine this. I give you $100. You have to offer some of it to a complete stranger. If they say yes to your offer, you both get to keep the cash. But if they reject it, you both walk away with nothing. So think about it for a second. What's the lowest amount you'd be willing to offer?
Now, this is where it gets really fascinating. Pure, cold, rational economic theory says you should offer the smallest possible amount, like $1, right? And the other person, they should totally accept it because, hey, $1 is better than $0. But that is not what happens. In reality, most people offer somewhere around 30 to 40%. And what's even crazier, really lowball offers get rejected all the time. People would literally rather get nothing than accept a deal they feel is unfair. This huge gap between logic and human emotion, well, that's exactly why we need experiments in the first place.
Okay, so to figure out what's really going on here, economists basically had to become scientists. They created their own controlled worlds, the economic laboratory, so they could isolate all the different factors and truly understand what makes us tick.
So what are these labs actually for? Well, the economist Alvin Roth, he broke it down into 3 really brilliant goals. First, he called it speaking to theorists. That's using experiments to test and poke holes in economic models. Second, searching for facts, which is all about finding those consistent, repeatable patterns and how people behave. And then my favorite, whispering to princes, using what you've learned to help guide actual real-world policymakers.
But here's the catch, and it's a big one. The very control that makes labs so powerful, well, that's also what makes them artificial. So how can we be sure that the way people act inside a sterile lab has anything to do with how they'll act out in the messy, complicated real world? And this isn't some new concern. Way back in 1942, big names like Milton Friedman were already raising their eyebrows. They worried that this kind of lab setting could produce results that seemed believable, plausible, but were actually totally false, spurious, once you stepped outside the lab doors. This gets us to the heart of a really crucial scientific concept, external validity. It's the million-dollar question, really. Can the results from this one study be generalized to other people, in other places, in other situations? If the answer is no, well then the experiment's real-world value is pretty limited. And to see this in action, just look what happened when researchers took that same ultimatum game we talked about and played it all across the globe. They ran it in 15 different small-scale societies, and the results were all over the map. The Machuenga in Peru, for example, they live in these really independent family units. Their average offer? Low, just 26%. But then you have the Lamalera in Indonesia. They're cooperative whale hunters who have to share everything to survive. Their average offer? A massive 58%. So yeah, culture and context, they change everything. So if the lab doesn't always reflect the real world, what do? What's a solution? Well, one incredibly clever approach is to just flip the entire problem on its head. You know that old saying, right? If the mountain won't come to Muhammad, Muhammad must go to the mountain. Well, that's kind of the idea here. If you can't make your experiment perfectly mimic a complex real-world situation, why not try to engineer the real-world situation to mimic the clean logic of an experiment? A perfect example of this is the FCC spectrum auctions. Back in the 90s, the US government had to figure out how to sell off these super valuable, super complex broadcast licenses, and theory alone just couldn't crack it. So what did they do? Economists built what was basically a flight simulator for the economy. They ran lab experiments as testbeds to try out all sorts of different auction rules. The lab became a workshop for building policy, and the final design was based directly on what they learned. And the result? Get this. Between 1994 and 1997, the auctions they designed brought in over $23 billion for the government. Just a staggering success and a powerful, powerful example of how a lab-based idea, when you engineer it into the real world, can have a massive impact. Okay, but let's be real. You can't always engineer an entire system like a multi-billion-dollar auction. So what's the other option? Well, if you can't bring the world to the lab, you just have to take the lab out into the world. And this brings us to the whole fascinating world of field experiments. Instead of pulling people into a lab, researchers take their studies out into people's natural environments, where they live, where they work. The whole goal is to build a bridge between the clean, controlled lab and the messy reality of everyday life. And sometimes people don't even know they're part of a study.
So what happens when you cross that bridge from the lab to the field? Well, things can change. A lot. Take the endowment effect. It's a famous lab finding that says we put a higher value on things just because we happen to own them. But an economist named John List went out and tested this with experienced sports card traders. You know, pros who do this for a living. And he found that for them, the bias almost completely vanished. Real-world market experience basically washed it away.
Here's another one for you. In the lab, experiments consistently show that people have strong social preferences. We care about fairness. We like to return favors. But then a field experiment looked at a real market where buyers made offers and sellers decided on the quality of the good. And you know what they found? No strong statistical link between higher prices and higher quality. It suggested in a real market, those fairness preferences maybe weren't as powerful as the lab results might have you believe.
So where does all this leave us? It really shows that experiments are an incredibly valuable tool, no question. But they're not a panacea, they're not a magic bullet. There's this fundamental trade-off that's right at the heart of all this work.
It all comes down to this fundamental trade-off. On one side, you have the lab. It gives you incredible certainty and control, what scientists call high internal validity. But the price you pay is that it's artificial. On the other side, you have the real world. You get tons of realism, that's high external validity, but you lose all that control because, well, the world is messy. So researchers are constantly doing this balancing act between the two, certainty versus realism.
Economic experiments give us this powerful peek under the hood at the mechanics of human decision-making, but they always come with an asterisk. So the next time you see a headline about a cool new behavioral study, you'll have the perfect question to ask. Okay, but how far is it from that lab to my real life?